Milwaukee, Wisconsin, an industrial city in the Midwest where winter nights are so cold that even time itself pulls inward. In the North Side's worn-out neighborhoods, where freight trains drown out midnight cries, women disappeared and no one noticed. Not because they had no family, but because they live at the edge of society's attention. Addiction, no fixed home, sometimes prostitution. When they went silent, people assumed they were sleeping under a bridge, at a shelter, or simply gone. Between 1986 and 2007, at least 7 women were strangled to death in Milwaukee. Different faces, different stories, but all shared 2 things: a quiet disappearance and the same terrifying method of death. The police didn't connect the dots. The evidence was thin, the dead too invisible. They were buried or stored in cold drawers, files marked unsolved and left to fade, until DNA spoke, and a name emerged from the dark: Walter E. Ellis, the Milwaukee North Side Strangler, a man who lived among them, yet was never really seen. Milwaukee, October 1986. They found Deborah Harris, 31 years old, in a narrow alleyway between 2 brick buildings. A light drizzle soaked the trash-strewn pavement. She lay on her side, hair matted with blood, neck bruised with fingerprints, clear, deep, even, like marks left by a machine. No drag marks nearby. No noise heard the night before. No one noticed she was gone. And when her identity was confirmed, police wrote, "Known history of narcotics and prostitution. No next of kin has come forward. Cause of death: manual strangulation. No weapon. No rape. No strong forensic leads." The lead officer jotted in his report, "Third strangulation case this year with similar signs. No known links." The file was closed in 2 weeks. No suspect. No headlines. Deborah was forgotten. But in 2009, when cold case units reviewed unsolved murders, a degraded DNA sample from under Deborah's fingernails, stored on a faded magnetic disc, matched a man named Walter Ellis, recently arrested in an unrelated case. His file had once been mislabeled. His DNA once misfiled. He had lived right there, in the same North Side neighborhood Deborah passed through every night. Some say he didn't choose his victims. He chose those he believed no one would look for. And that autumn night, in a dark Milwaukee alley, Deborah Harris became his first final breath. Milwaukee, spring 1987. Just months after the death of Deborah Harris, another woman, Irene Smith, was found dead in the bathroom of an abandoned building near Teutonia Avenue. She lay on her back, eyes open, arms crossed over her chest, as if someone had placed her there, unhurried, unafraid of being caught. Police noted no signs of sexual assault, bruising around the neck, a strand of hair on her left hand, not hers, no match in the system. Outside, a witness reported seeing a tall black man smoking under the porch next door around 4 a.m. That night, when asked to describe the face, the witness shook her head. "I didn't look straight at him. Something about him felt wrong. Not dangerous, just like he belonged there. Too much." The press didn't run the story. Police didn't link it to any previous case. Irene Smith's file was closed after 10 days, labeled likely personal dispute. But at the morgue, a young forensic technician, fresh out of school, noticed that the bruising on Irene's neck formed a specific arc, identical to another case. Not nearby, but same method. He penciled a note in the file's margin: patterned strangulation, consistent pressure, likely right hand, extended index finger. No one read that line. No one followed up. Walter Ellis still lived among them. He didn't hide, didn't move, still chatted with neighbors about the weather, beer prices, last night's game. He just made sure no one looked at him for longer than 3 seconds. A laundromat owner once recalled, "He came every week with a jacket that smelled like smoke. Never joked, never swore, never smiled. But once, I swear, it felt like he knew I wouldn't dare ask more." In one of the few surviving photos of him from that year, a group picture at a neighborhood barbecue. He stood in the back row, slightly off to the side. No one stood close. No one turned toward him. The camera was blurry, but zoom in and you'll see he was the only one not smiling. Walter Ellis didn't need to hide. He only needed people not to look. State Medical Archives of Wisconsin, sublevel B3, where fluorescent lights flickered constantly and the humidity wore down paper before anyone could read it. In November 2009, a month after Walter Ellis was arrested, the investigative unit received an urgent directive. Comb through all Milwaukee medical record from 1980 to 1990. Search for traces of him, named or unnamed. 3 days later, in a mislabeled file folder, Ellis, a records analyst named Martha Barker discovered a yellowed half-page, folded, wedged between two unrelated pulmonary charts. It wasn't a medical report. No heading, just a typewritten copy, the ink half-faded. Patient, identity unknown. Date admitted, June 27, 1981, Langdon Shelter, Milwaukee. Condition, suspected mood disorder, level 2. Behavior, laughs alone. No direct response to verbal contact. Frequently touches left wrist. Physician's note, recommend 60-day observation. If no next of kin, transfer. In the top right corner, almost erased in pencil, was a small mark. W. When compared to Ellis's 1992 intake signature from a temporary shelter, the handwriting matched. The tilt of the E slanted the same. The angle, identical. No additional records existed from Langdon. The shelter had closed in 1985. Most documentation was destroyed in a flood during 1989. But that admission note, the one Martha found, remained the only known evidence that Walter Ellis had been clinically observed as unstable more than 25 years earlier. And no one followed up. No assigned doctor. No supervisor. No family. Just a man, laughing to himself, and repeatedly touching his left wrist when silent. When police re-examined photos from the third crime scene, one image, fuzzy, tucked at the bottom, captured something easily missed. The victim's left wrist bent slightly outward, and faintly, as if etched by a fingernail, a single capital E. No blood, no message, just the residue of a ritual. Born inside a shelter no one remembered. Milwaukee, April 1988. A woman's body was found in the city landfill near the old industrial district in the north. A trash collector made the discovery while trying to lift a stack of rain-soaked cardboard. Beneath it lay a naked corpse, curled, eyes open, head tilted to one side, as if listening to something that no longer existed. She carried no ID, no distinctive scars. No one came forward. On the autopsy report, she was recorded as Jane Doe number 041988. Estimated age, 25 to 35. Race, African American. But what made the coroner pause wasn't how she died. It was what remained on her body. Seminal fluid was found in both vaginal and anal cavities, bruising around the hips, wrists, and inner arms. No signs of a major struggle, as if the victim had been violated while unconscious. Her left hand bore scratch marks, a broken nail. Beneath the nail, trace amounts of male skin tissue. DNA analysis revealed a match to an unknown male profile. The same partial match recovered from under Deborah Harris's fingernails. At the time, no database was strong enough to connect them. The file was closed after 21 days. No name, no suspect. No one looked. Internal reports didn't call it serial. Just another homeless victim, likely tied to drug use or sex work. Closure reason, difficult trace, high testing cost. But a forensic tech, who had also worked Deborah's case, wrote a personal note. Strangulation, arc matches Harris. Consistent pressure, likely same offender. Post-mortem sexual activity, high deviation potential. She was never named, never claimed. No news coverage, only a black and white photo, full body, landfill background. Sunlight cutting through torn tarp. Near her feet, a single footprint in wet mud. Bared up male, no shoe. No sock. Years later, when Walter Ellis was arrested, his DNA matched the Jane Doe number 041988 sample exactly. During the first interrogation, he said only one thing. I don't know who she was. but I don't think she knew either. Not everyone goes missing the same way. Some vanish in screams, pounding doors, and a flurry of news headlines. And some slip into the dark with no one ever asking when they left. Walter Ellis seemed to choose only the latter. Since the late 1980s, a slow, steady trickle of disappearances spread across Milwaukee's north side. Black women, aged 20 to early 40s, most with histories of addiction or unstable housing. They all shared three traits. They lived alone, they walked alone, and when they vanished, no one searched right away. One blurry surveillance clip from 1991, captured at a convenience store near Capitol Drive, shows a woman buying liquor just before midnight. Behind her stands a tall man in a long black coat. She walks out. He follows. That's it. 3 days later, her body was found by the Menominee River. Strangled. No signs of sexual assault. No murder weapon. She was briefly listed as a possible victim of an unknown male suspect. But her case faded, like ink spreading through damp paper in an old archive box. He didn't choose the weak, didn't choose the pretty, didn't kill for lust. He chose the isolated. When no one notices a person, they can almost die without being killed. Ellis just gave him one final push. One witness once said she saw a woman crying at a bus stop around 2 a.m. And a man approached, sat beside her, said nothing, simply placed his hand on her wrist, and the two walked off together in silence. The woman was never identified. No body was found, only her scarf left behind on the bench, with a faint imprint like a hand had just been lifted. Walter Ellis left no notes, no threats, no declarations. He just stepped in when someone had grown too used to being alone. Milwaukee, 1995. A 28-year-old black woman was found unconscious beneath an overpass near Center Street. Clothes torn and misaligned. Dried blood around her genitals. Neck bruised. Pulse faint. She didn't die, but she could no longer recall, clearly or fully, what had happened. When she awoke in the hospital, she spoke just 2 words. Long finger. Then she wept and said nothing else for 3 more days. During the investigation, police screened names of individuals previously arrested for sexual violence in the surrounding area. One name appeared in the first batch of results. Walter Ellis, arrested in 1981 for sexual assault, but released due to lack of evidence. The file was thin. No mugshot, no restraining orders. Just a short incident report ending with, no longer considered a high risk. No follow-up recommended. The investigator noted, unconfirmed, low risk, pursuing alternate leads. The name Walter Ellis remained on file for 19 hours. Then it was discarded. He slipped back into the dark, where he had always belonged. Months later, another woman was found dead behind an old factory just 2 blocks from the earlier attack. Victim, unidentified. Cause of death, strangulation. Left wrist fractured. Clear signs of anal and vaginal penetration with tissue tears. Semen was collected, but due to forensic lab underfunding, the sample was never processed. The file was labeled pending and remained there for 14 years. Walter Ellis never needed a plan. He just needed a system too distracted to see him, a name too ordinary to raise alarms. When asked about the 1995 assault during his later interrogation, Ellis looked directly into the camera, smiled faintly, and whispered, I don't know her name, but I remember her wrist. Soft, and it took a long time to stop shaking. Milwaukee, 1995. The same year Walter Ellis disappeared from the scope of investigation. Police announced they had caught the main suspect in the murder of Jessica Payne, a young woman found strangled and sexually assaulted in a South Side park. The man they arrested, Chaunot, 21 years old. Black. No prior record. Part-time kitchen assistant. The basis for the arrest, statements from 2 acquaintances claiming I had once bragged about meeting and doing something with a girl in the park that day. No forensic evidence. No DNA match. No one tested the semen found inside Jessica's body. I was sentenced to life in prison, based solely on secondhand testimony and a vague timeline. Throughout the trial, he insisted he was innocent, but he fit the kind of fear the public was ready to believe. At the same time, Ott entered prison. Walter Ellis was still living in Milwaukee, in a small apartment near the north side, but he didn't move. He didn't change. By 1997, two more women had been murdered in the exact same way as Jessica: manual strangulation, anal trauma, and untested semen left behind. But no one considered that the wrong man might be behind bars. The system had its scapegoat. In 2001, a petition was filed requesting DNA testing. It took 4 years to approve. Jessica's rape kit was finally processed. No match to Ott, but no identified source either. Ott remained behind bars for another 4 years. Only in 2009, after Ellis was arrested on unrelated charges, and his DNA entered the system, did police panic. His profile perfectly matched the semen found in Jessica Payne. The woman ought to have been imprisoned for killing for 13 years. When asked why he didn't step forward while Ott was on trial, Ellis simply shrugged. "No one asked me." And he looked guilty enough. Milwaukee, 2002. A 3-day rainstorm caused the Menominee River to swell, washing away layers of debris and rotting wood along the northern bank. As the water receded, it revealed the cracked foundation of an old house, half submerged in mud, hidden behind the trees, no visible address. Land records showed the property had once been rented in 1993 by someone named Walter Ellis, listed as a short-term tenant. No lease, no utilities, no follow-up inspection. When officers arrived, the back door had already been broken. Inside, empty. No furniture, no fresh footprints. But on the wooden walls, dried blood had darkened to a deep, rust-colored brown, forming faded rings like old mineral stains. In one corner, a floorboard had lifted slightly. Beneath it, a thick fabric bundle, folded tightly, bound with nylon cord. Inside were a woman's torn blouse, shoulder ripped, dried blood on the hem, a cheap perfume bottle, cracked at the cap, a pair of red plastic earrings, identical to the ones worn by Jane Doe number 041988. No new DNA, no usable fingerprints. But the blood on the wall matched a victim murdered in 1998, a case never solved. At the time, Ellis was still buried in system blind spots. Everything had remained still until the river pulled it loose. When forensic examiners studied the house's layout, one detail stood out. The back room was lined with old acoustic foam, stapled in with rusted nails. No windows, no lights, ceiling covered in black fabric. Felt like a sealed chamber. No one knew how many people had entered that room. All that was certain, no missing persons reports were filed in that area for years. And no one had thought twice about a house with no address, by a river where only the moon bore witness. When Ellis was arrested 7 years later, he didn't deny ever living there. He simply said, "It was quiet there, and in that place, I could hear other people's thoughts." Milwaukee Forensic Storage, May 2004. During an inventory of unprocessed evidence bags from cold cases, an intern technician named Alondra Miller found an unlabeled nylon pouch, marked only with a faded handwritten note. Recovered, Lot 419, South Riverbend. Inside the bag, a torn wad of toilet paper, loosely wrapped around several uneven tufts of short women's hair, some still attached to pieces of scalp. Black hair, straight, a few strands stained with dried blood. DNA testing revealed. For distinct hair samples belonged to 4 different female victims, each found strangled between 1992 and 1998. No case had been linked to the others. No witnesses, no suspects, but now in the same plastic bag. 4 women were silently stitched together by their severed strands. No DNA from the killer, no usable fingerprints. Only one long, silver hair lying outside the bundle, deliberately placed, separate. Analysis showed it belonged to none of the victims. It matched no known profile, but the single gray hair carried traces of sweat and sebum from a middle-aged black male with rare African gene markers, matching Walter Ellis by 80%. To most, The bag of hair would have seemed random. But for Ellis, it might have been a collection. A subtle imprint. No flair, no boast. Just enough to remind himself. He had possessed them. At least once. No one knew why he kept the hair. No one knew why those four. But all victims shared the same traits. Strangled manually. No overt rape, but signs of sexual intrusion. And most notably, their hair had been cut unevenly, as if with 2 fingers and a dull blade. Later, when asked about the hairbag, Ellis tilted his head, smiled faintly, and replied, "I didn't cut their hair. I unhooked it." Luis Ramirez, senior forensic technician for the Milwaukee Crime Lab, retired in 2001, quietly like a door closing with no wind. After 38 years of service, Ramirez left behind no fame, no groundbreaking exonerations, no solved headline cases. He had only one thing: memory of the evidence no one ever tested. September 2009. After Walter Ellis was arrested, a wide-scale review of outdated samples was launched. Ramirez, living alone in a 5th-floor Edgewood apartment, was asked to return, only to trace unlogged biological material. In sublevel B2, he stepped into a cold room sealed off for 5 years. In the back corner stood a rusted steel cabinet, the lock corroded. Handwritten on the surface. Unprocessed samples, 1986 to 1990. Ramirez pried it open with a wrench. Inside, beneath layers of dust and curling paper, was a small aluminum box labeled #WEX 1897. Inside the box, a single glass vial. Within it, a piece of cotton stained dark amber, hardened by time. Attached note: vaginal fluid from unidentified female victim, November 1987. Collected behind the old theater lot. No suspect. No comparison sample. Hold for review. Ramirez didn't recall the case. Didn't remember the victim. But he remembered the smell of aged human fluid. The moment he unscrewed the cap, he ran the sample through the new system. 2 hours later, the result appeared on screen. DNA match, Walter Ellis. 100% certainty. The victim had no name. Died in silence. No ID. No photo. No missing persons report. No record she had ever lived. All that remained was a scrap of cotton. Had that sample been tested in 1987, Ellis could have been arrested 22 years earlier. No Deborah. No Jane Doe. Jessica Payne. No wrongful conviction of Chant OTT in own need for 7 final breaths. Ramirez said nothing as he left the room. He quietly shut the door, walked the cold brick hallway, and wrote a single line in his notebook. "I think death can queue up. It just doesn't always come in order." August 2007. The final victim was discovered beneath an unfinished overpass in Milwaukee's Western Industrial Zone. She was the 7th, dating back to 1986, and the last to die before Ellis was arrested. Her body was half buried in loose soil and debris, hair caked with mud, skirt torn at the knees, one leg dislocated. Her posture suggested dragging, yet no drag marks were found. Clear hand marks bruised her neck. Broken fingernails. Bruising on hips, chest, and heels. Semen recovered, as with previous victims, but this time, anal trauma revealed unusually forceful penetration, misaligned with natural position. The violence had escalated. The damage wasn't just to kill. It was to leave a memory in flesh, even if the body would never remember. During scene documentation, a new forensic photographer noticed something strange in a frame. At the edge, beneath a concrete pillar shadow, a faint elongated silhouette appeared. Its angle didn't match the daylight source. It leaned into a direction that didn't exist. And more disturbingly, there was nothing in the environment that could have cast it. The photo was archived, never mentioned. The photographer later transferred out, not from fear, only because he no longer wanted to photograph what wasn't still there. Police reviewed victim site maps from 1986 to 2007. 7 bodies, 7 scenes, seemingly random, disconnected. But when plotted on a map, they formed a closed arc, encircling 3 key Milwaukee neighborhoods. At the center of that arc, between two old rail lines, lay an abandoned transformer yard, a site in use since the 1970s. No reports ever mentioned it. No one investigated it. No one asked. But every victim had died along the curve's edge, as if they had nearly been brought to the center. But none had reached it. After Ellis's arrest, detectives reconstructed his employment history. He once worked part-time as a janitor for the city's utility division in the early 90s. And each week, he cleaned that abandoned transformer yard, a place with no cameras, no supervision, no sound but rats, rusted metal, and static electricity. No one ever went in. No one thought they had to. No one ever knew if anyone had ever come back out. The shadow in a photograph might have been lens flare. Or perhaps it was someone who had stood there all along, just never in anyone's direct line of sight. Over 21 years of killing, no one ever saw Walter Ellis carry a weapon. No knife, no rope, no strangling device, no bag, no sign of preparation. Ellis entered his victims' lives like a shadow, empty-handed, with no reason, no warning. Yet they still died, still overpowered, still strangled, still violated, as if everything needed was already waiting wherever he went. When crime scenes were reconstructed, investigators noticed a silent pattern. Nearly every murder occurred in a place where something sharp or coarse was within reach. An abandoned warehouse with rusted coat hangers, an old park with jagged branches, a landfill scattered with sliced lids, a power station with exposed wiring, a bridge underpass with rebar jutting from cracked concrete. No two locations were the same, but each held something that could kill, if viewed with enough calm. Ellis left no tools behind. No rope, no blade, no bloodied object. But on several victims' wrists were shallow, clean cuts, as if someone had simply tested the blade for sharpness. Forensics suggested the killer may have carried a personal knife. But when Ellis's home was searched, no suspicious blades were found. No kits. No dried blood, no signs of wiping or washing. He kept nothing, took nothing in, brought nothing out. He simply arrived, caused death, and left, as if violence was a rhythm, not a toolkit. One analyst wrote in the report, "The killer made no preparations. He only used what the setting provided. This only happens when the murderer believes every environment is complicit." No one knew why Ellis was never caught in the act. Perhaps because he never left anything to follow. Or perhaps because he never needed to carry the blade. He was the blade. September 7th, 2009. An empty beer can was found in a Milwaukee homeless shelter. Still damp on the outside, clinging to its rim. A single silver hair curled slightly, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The security staff didn't know why they sent it in for testing. Just procedure. Something that should be done without much thought behind it. But that hair had been waiting to be found for nearly 3 decades. DNA analysis confirmed. The strand belonged to Walter E. Ellis, a 49-year-old man with no stable occupation, a drifter across multiple Northside neighborhoods, previously arrested on minor charges, but never had his DNA officially entered into the system. Back then, the law didn't require it, not unless a conviction was made. Ellis's background was pulled. Inside, a long list of addresses he'd lived at, worked near, passed through, and every one matched the locations where victims had been found. No one had ever linked the cases. No one thought Ellis had the profile of a serial killer. He wasn't violent in public, wasn't loud, wasn't remarkable. He simply existed. And for 21 years, death passed through him like wind through an open window. That silver hair, shed in a quiet night, clinging to a beer kin by sweat, forgotten completely by Ellis, became the thread that redrew the map of his crimes. He was arrested that same day. No resistance, no questions, no confession. He sat down as if he'd been waiting his whole life to be named. March 2011. Walter E. Ellis was brought into Courtroom 6 at the Milwaukee Superior Court for his first hearing. No media crowd, no protesters, no victims' families in attendance. Just 3 empty rows, a few legal officials, and a man with nothing left to conceal. Ellis entered without handcuffs, wearing a pale gray prison uniform, head shaved clean, walking slowly and steadily. As if he knew every stone on the road he was now completing. He didn't look at anyone, didn't shift his eyes, didn't lower his head. When asked whether he pleaded guilty, he said nothing. His attorney stood, and on his behalf, entered a plea of no contest, neither admitting nor denying. No one understood why. There was no legal strategy, no attempt to lessen the sentence, just an acceptance, with no explanation offered. The case file, nearly 1,200 pages thick, was read quickly. Each victim, name, age, cause of death, passed like an inventory list long past expiration. Each breath, each body, each final moment, read aloud in a flat, neutral tone. Ellis sat still, unmoving, unreactive. He did not shed a single tear. At the end, the judge delivered the sentence. 7 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole. No applause, no shouting, no sobbing. Ellis left the courtroom the same way he entered, leaving nothing behind. No final glance, no memory worth anchoring. Only a seat still warm on the wooden bench, and a name written in the records. Yet no one ever truly knew who he was. December 1st, 2013. Walter E. Ellis was found dead in his solitary cell at South Dakota State Penitentiary. No one had seen him fall ill. No blood. No noise. He died in the night at 2:47 a.m. In his sleep, according to the official report. Cardiac arrest. No known cause. No signs of suicide. No signs of poisoning. There was no funeral. No relatives claimed the body. His ashes were shipped back to Milwaukee, stored at the county morgue for 18 months, then transferred to the city's unclaimed burial field. A plot with no headstones, only weeds, broken stones, and the forgotten. On the wooden stake that marked his place, it read, "Unclaimed, male, cremated remains. No ID marker." The final forensic summary listed 7 victims with confirmed DNA matches. But everyone knew the number was higher. No one knew how many exactly. Perhaps 10, perhaps 13, perhaps. He never stopped. Only the last victim had yet to be found. Walter E. Ellis left no final note, no confession, no memoir, no motive. In 21 years, he never spoke of why. He simply passed through, and 7 people stopped breathing behind him. To outsiders, he was a name. To police, a file. To journalists, a serial killer. But to his victims, he was the last face they saw, and the reason no one ever saw them again. 7 final breaths, not in the same place, not the same time, but all ending the same way. Not with a scream, but with a quiet footstep into a place no one thought could swallow an entire person.